Jesus' name let angels prostrate fall. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Ye chosen seed of Israel's race, ye ransomed from the fall. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all. Hail him who saves you by his grace, and crown him Lord of all.
Good morning. Please stand and worship with us together. Come thou fount, every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Jesus.
And the parish of
Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray for Matt as he comes to bring the message that you have laid on his heart. I pray that you will be willing to share any new thoughts, and that we will be willing and open to receive what he has to say. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Elvin, Frank, and Monica, for leading us in worship. As we were singing those songs, my mind was kind of going on a journey of what's in my life that feels like the sea around me, the billows around me are rolling. What is it that's in my life right now that I am not able to solve myself? And the last song was when we finally make our will the Lord's will, then we can find freedom. This morning, I'd like, if you would turn with me to John chapter 11, and I'd like to look at some people who were in a storm, so to speak. They were in a predicament they couldn't solve, and they needed the Jesus who came walking on the water to calm the waves. They needed that same Jesus to come into their life and to help them in their journey. John chapter 11. And as we pull into John chapter 11, it's helpful if we know that in John chapter 10, Jesus was just in the temple with the religious leaders. And Jesus said some things that the religious leaders did not like, and they accused him of blasphemy. And they decided they're going to stone Jesus. But Jesus, in only the way Jesus can do things, slipped through the crowd and was not stoned. And we read the end of chapter 10, we read that Jesus went to the other side of Jordan. And so he goes from Jerusalem, he crosses the Jordan River, and he hangs out there for a while, just to let the environment cool down, so to speak. And from Jerusalem, we don't know how far or where exactly he went to the side of Jordan, but the best I could tell, from Jerusalem to the Jordan River is about 15 miles. So Jesus traveled 15 plus miles, put some distance between himself and those religious leaders who he just made angry. And we pick up in chapter 11 here, Jesus is on the other side of the Jordan. We pick up in here about the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They are in the town of Bethany. Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem, towards the Jordan. So maybe there's 10 to 13 miles between Mary and Martha and Lazarus and Jesus when we pick up the story. John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord's ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So we're going to pause. So here we have Lazarus is ill. We have Mary and Martha. We learn something about Mary here particularly. Mary is the one who, if you keep reading in chapter 12, we'll find out that Mary comes before Jesus and she anoints his feet in preparation for his burial. I find it interesting as I look at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, they do a lot of things that make sense to us today because we can look back and see what all happened. And I have to wonder, how did Mary, Martha, and Lazarus really know? Did they really know what they were doing? Did she really know when she was anointing Jesus' feet that it was in preparation for his burial? Jesus told him he's going to die, but every time he mentioned that, people didn't believe him, or they thought he meant something else. But here we see that it says that this was the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. It's a place where Jesus went. He stayed there. He stayed there with them whenever he was in the town of Bethany. There was something special about them. Jesus had a heart for them. And these sisters knew that, and Lazarus must have been deathly ill because they sent someone 10 to 13 miles to find Jesus. To say, hey, this guy's sick. The one whom you love, Jesus. And so Jesus must have told or done something that Mary and Martha realized that Jesus was really fascinated by Lazarus. Jesus really loved him. As I thought about that, is Jesus able to love anyone less than anyone else? Does Jesus love you and I as much as he loved Lazarus? Is there anything I can do that causes Jesus not to love me? I mean, here was a guy who says Jesus loved him. He was ill. It was a physical illness. What might my illness be? Maybe I have a spiritual illness. Maybe I'm not quite right with God. Maybe I'm not quite right, or not quite where Jesus wants me to be today. Maybe I'm struggling emotionally. Maybe I'm struggling physically. Maybe I'm struggling mentally. Maybe I'm struggling with a thorn in my flesh, or it's just a temptation that keeps coming my way and I just can't beat it. Jesus still loves you. And we're going to see what Jesus does, because a lot of things that Jesus does don't make sense to me. So here's a man whom he loves, it says in verse 3, but as soon as Jesus heard it, he says this illness will not lead to his death, but it's for the glory of God. And so we read on in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. He must have really loved them, because in 5 verses we've seen twice that Jesus loved them. So when he heard, verse 6, that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Doesn't make sense. Here's someone you love, Jesus. You have the ability to heal him. And as soon as you hear it, you decide you're going to stay 2 days longer. And then after those 2 days, now you got to travel 13 miles on feet to get there. Let's start doing some math. How long is it going to take until Jesus actually gets there? If you can walk 7 miles a day. And so Jesus says, I'm going to wait 2 more days. Verse 7, then after this, he said to the disciples, so after the 2 days, let us go again to Judea. So they're heading back towards Jerusalem, the place where he just ran for his life. Remember, he's headed back that same direction. And that's why the disciples respond to him here in verse 8. The disciples say to him, Rabbi, the Jews who are just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? The disciples are scratching their head. Jesus, you're not making sense. Why would you go back to the very place that these people just tried to kill you? These people, these Jews, these religious leaders who were angry, they hated you, they were hostile towards you, they were critical of you, they accused you of blasphemy. So the disciples did something that only good disciples would do. They were trying to protect Jesus. Jesus, don't go back there. Jesus' response, again, in ways that didn't probably make sense totally to the disciples. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? I believe what Jesus was saying there is, time's limited. I don't have a whole lot of time. There's only 12 hours of the day where it's light. Or, I think it's just what Jesus' way of saying, I need to keep moving. He then goes on to teach his disciples a lesson. Verse 10, as Jesus talked about the light, the 12 hours of the day and time being limited. If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. As I ponder what does this mean, I believe we can look at the word day there. And we could change that to the word knowledge. If anyone walks in the knowledge of me, Jesus says, they will not stumble. Why? Because I'm the light. But if anyone walks in the night, or if anyone does not walk in the knowledge of me, they will stumble. After saying these things, verse 11, he says to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. Again, Jesus says, our friend, someone who he loves. And obviously, since Jesus made it plural and he says our friend, referring to the disciples, Lazarus must have been a friend of the disciples as well. And Jesus says, I'm going to awaken him. Jesus is telling the disciples, he's giving them a hint, something big is going to happen here. Something big is going to happen. The disciples, verse 12, said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. And so when Jesus mentioned about sleep, the disciples naturally thought he meant a physical sleep, and the disciples are saying, Jesus, if he fell asleep, that's good. He's resting. There will be healing. And I know that Jesus gets frustrated because we've seen Jesus drive the money changers out of the temple in frustration with them and defiling his Father's house. And I believe there might be a little bit of frustration with Jesus here in verse 13. He says, now Jesus spoke of his death, but they taught that he was talking about physical rest. Verse 14, then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. He's dead. He's not sleeping like you think. He is dead. And I had to wonder what happened, or what the disciples think at that moment. How did they feel? I mean, we don't know the whole timeline here. Maybe as soon as they heard that Lazarus was sick, the disciples told Jesus, we can't go back there. And then there was a 2-day waiting period. So maybe the disciples are starting to blame themselves right now and say, we caused Lazarus to die because we convinced Jesus to not go. I don't know what the time frame, but I'm just kind of letting my mind roam a little bit here, because there's times in my life that I convince myself not to do something, and then bad things happen. People get hurt, or I get hurt, and I begin to question, why did I do that? Why did I not just follow God's plan? Why did I not just do what Jesus was telling me to do? Why did I have to create this hardship in my life? And so Jesus told the disciples as they were walking, Lazarus is dead. And then Jesus goes on to do something again that Jesus does. It doesn't make sense. He says, and for your sake, I'm glad. For your sake, Steve, I'm glad Lazarus died. For your sake, Roger, I'm glad Lazarus died. And again, the disciples, I believe, had to be scratching their heads saying, what is wrong with this guy? We don't understand him. And then Jesus goes on to say, the reason I'm glad is so that you may believe. And we're going to see, I'm reading out of the ESV, but in the ESV, we're going to see the word believe 9 times in this chapter. Believe. And I believe, no pun intended, that is why Jesus did all of this with the case of Lazarus. Why? So that you and I believe. Because we're doubters. We're doubters. And just like we sang in these songs, there's many times in my life where I doubted that Jesus had the ability to fix the problem, but I had a lot of confidence in myself that I had the ability to. And once I get to the place like the disciples in that boat, and they were rowing and couldn't get through that storm, once they get to the place, and once I get to the place of saying, okay, I can't do this, and I take my hand off the oar and say, I'm in for the ride, Jesus, whatever you take me, whatever happens, and I believe in him, then you see Jesus carry you through the storm. Maybe the storm doesn't stop around you, but there's this sense of peace. And so Jesus says, I'm glad Lazarus died so that you may believe. because I'm going to do something. Jesus says, so let's go to him. Verse 16, we read about a man named Thomas. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. This is the same Thomas that we call Doubting Thomas. This is the same Thomas who, after Jesus died, after he rose from the dead, after he showed himself to the disciples and Thomas wasn't there, and the disciples were telling Thomas about it, Thomas says, I don't believe it. I will not believe it until I see the prints in his hand and thrust my finger into his side. But here we see this doubting Thomas, this one who doubts. He's the one who steps up and to the rest of the disciples say, I'm going with Jesus, that I can die with him. Are you guys coming with me? Let's go. So even though Thomas was a doubter, even though he might question things, here he expresses loyalty. He was willing to go with Jesus back towards Jerusalem with the full mindset that it's probably going to cost me my life. He had to lay down his own desires for the desire of Jesus. And many times I believe in life, Jesus calls you and I to lay down our desires. This is what Matt wants. Matt, lay it down. And then I'll show you a better way. I'll show you some neat things in life. And so they're traveling, and they're walking back towards Bethany, towards Jerusalem. In verse 17 through 27, we see Jesus coming and comforting Mary and Martha. Verse 17. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. And so that starts to compute the math. Jesus waited 2 days, and then he had to walk back towards Bethany, 13 miles, cover 7 or 8 miles a day. We're at the 4-day period there. Jesus comes back and finds that Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days. My question I ask, did that surprise Jesus? Or is that just John's narrative and the way John sees it, that you know what, when Jesus came back, he found out that Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days? I believe that Jesus already knew that. It was just the disciples, it was John and the disciples who found out that Lazarus was in the tomb 4 days. And then it goes on to say in verse 18, Bethany near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brothers. And so here we see the Jews, and to me this is demonstrating community, it's demonstrating family. Mary and Martha are grieving. Their brother has passed away. He's been buried 4 days. And these Jews, their family, the community around them of believers are still with them. And they're still grieving with them. And they're caring for them. They're consoling them, helping to bring them comfort. And the reason that I think it's important for us to be able to grab the concept of the Jews being there is because of what happens later in the story. So I just wanted to point that out. Verse 20, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, so somehow word got to Martha, hey, Jesus is on the way to you. She went and she met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. I found it interesting that as we read about Mary and Martha time and time again, Martha's the one who always stayed in the house. She was the busybody. She was the one who made the food, prepared the meals, served Jesus. And Mary was the one who's always there with Jesus. And in this case now, we see it kind of flip. Mary stays in the house. Martha hears about Jesus coming, and Martha goes towards him. She goes out to meet him. And as I pondered that, I had to think, okay, here she is in this traumatic time of her life. Her brother passed away. She knows Jesus is coming. She knows that Jesus can bring comfort. She doesn't just sit and wait. She goes towards him. She puts effort into it. She has a desire to meet Jesus. And she's not content just to wait till Jesus gets to her, but she wants it sooner, and so she goes towards him. So when Martha, verse 20 again, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary stayed seated. Verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord. She greets him by honoring him. She calls him Lord. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Wow, what faith. I believe that Martha had seen Jesus perform many miracles of healing, and she knew that if Jesus would have just been here, he could have healed Lazarus. And so she's demonstrating her faith. She honored him by calling him Lord. She showed him her desire to meet him by running towards him. Now she demonstrates to him, here's my faith. In verse 22, she goes on to demonstrate her faith. She says, but even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. What exactly is Martha saying there? Do you think Martha even really knew what she meant when she said that? Jesus, even now I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you. Was Martha actually telling Jesus, I know, Jesus, that you can raise him from the dead right now if you just ask him? Is that what Martha was meaning? Let's read on and see if that's what Martha asked, if that's what Martha meant. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. That kind of tells me that Martha didn't really believe that Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead. Because when Jesus says, your brother will rise again, she says, I know that he will rise again at the last day, at the resurrection. It was not even in her mind that Jesus could raise him from the dead. And Jesus didn't condemn her, didn't say, Martha, 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 where's your faith? Jesus just used it as a teaching moment. Jesus says to her in verse 25, you want to talk about the resurrection, Martha? That's me. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this, Martha? And so here Jesus, in a weak moment of faith with Martha, teaches her some things that doesn't make sense. Okay, so how can someone who dies live, but yet if a person actually does live, they'll never die? How does that work? And I don't know how much time he gave Martha before he looked at her and says, do you believe what I just told you? Do you believe that I am the resurrection? Do you believe that I give life? Do you believe that those who die will live forever? And do you believe that those who live will never die? Do you believe that, Martha? I don't know if Martha knew what she was believing exactly. I don't think she fully understood it. But I love her response in verse 27. She says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, that you are the Son of God who is coming into the world. And as I look at Martha's response here, I see three things. I see her acknowledging, you're the Son of God. I see her worshiping, you are the Christ. I see her honoring Jesus by calling him Lord. And so there's so many things. We could preach a whole sermon just on Martha and her response. In her time of struggle, she didn't sit and camp out and wait for Jesus to come. She knew that he was the answer, and so she got up and she went towards him. And when she got to him, she acknowledged him, she worshiped him, she honored him. And then verse 28, when she had said all this, she went her way. She was comforted. She had peace. And so she went her way. And what did she do? She went and told her sister, hey, Jesus is in town, and he wants to talk to you. That's what she did in verse 28. And so she went and she called Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here. He is calling you. What I love about this is that Jesus did it in private. He met Martha at a place, we're going to read shortly. At a place, he met Martha, and then he stayed there and allowed Mary to come to him so he could meet with her privately and personally too, and to care for her. And Jesus wants to do that with each one of us. He wants to meet us at a place and care about us personally. And he wants to hear about our storms. He wants to hear about our illnesses. He wants to hear about the things that are troubling our hearts. Verse 29, and when Mary heard it, she rose quickly and left. Again, here's effort. Here's the desire. She heard that Jesus is in town. She got up quickly. Put effort into it to find Jesus. Verse 30, now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but he was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with Mary in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. And so here again, we see the community effort. Those around her who were caring for Mary, trying to comfort her. They saw her get up. They speculated she was going back to the gravesite to weep, and so they went with her to help comfort her. Verse 32, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I find it interesting that Mary's the one who is always at Jesus' feet. Here she fell at his feet. In chapter 12, next chapter, we'll find out that she anointed his feet and she wiped them with her hair. In multiple places, we read that Mary would sit at Jesus' feet when Jesus was teaching. We see Martha's response. Martha acknowledged that Jesus is the Christ, he's the Son of God, and that he's coming into the world. We see Martha honoring Jesus that way. That was a declaration, a verbal declaration. We don't see Mary verbally declarating Jesus for who he was other than calling him Lord, but we see her falling at his feet in worship. I found this little paragraph, a couple paragraphs here as I was preparing. I'm just going to read. The act of falling at or being at a person's feet has special significance. We see this when a Samaritan leper falls at Jesus' feet in gratitude after Jesus heals him in Luke 19. We see this with Legion, first falling at Jesus' feet begging for mercy. He also does this after Jesus healed him and he is in his right mind. The woman who touched Jesus' cloak also fell at his feet, as does Jairus when he comes to plead for Jesus to heal his daughter. In Matthew 28, when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary are running to tell the disciples that Jesus has risen, they encounter the resurrected Christ himself. They fall at his feet, clasp it, and they worship him. These all fall at Jesus' feet for different reasons, whether out of fear, gratitude, or petition. In all instances, though, there's a recognition and acknowledgement of who Jesus is. And so Mary, in doing this in one single action, she is saying, you are the Christ. You are the Son of God. You have come into the world. And so here we see two sisters in their trouble, their brother's dead, in the grave, no hope, finding their hope in Jesus by worshiping him and acknowledging who he is. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. I wonder what it looks like to see Jesus deeply moved in his spirit. What does that look like? Is Jesus deeply moved for you and me? Again, did he love Lazarus more than he loves you? Did he love Mary and Martha more than he loves you? I don't believe he did. I believe that Jesus is deeply moved and grieved in his spirit when he sees us hurting as well. Jesus then asked in verse 34, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. And so I don't know how far they are from the tomb. I don't know where Jesus met Mary and Martha. But there was a journey to the tomb. And so I just picture Jesus taking Mary in his arm, maybe putting his arm around her shoulder as they're walking towards the tomb. And as they're walking, Jesus is crying with Mary. He's grieving. He's sad because she's sad. He's hurting because she's hurting. So much so that those who were walking with them in verse 36, the Jews said, "See how he loved him." They saw the compassion in Jesus. They saw how he was hurting. And they interpreted that as love. And brothers and sisters, when you and I can see Jesus crying for us, we can then experience Jesus loving us in a new way that we've never experienced before. Jesus loves you that much. Verse 37, but some of them who were walking with them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?" They realized that Jesus had the potential to stop all this. And they were questioning, Jesus, why didn't Jesus stop it? Why didn't he stop Lazarus from dying? Why didn't Jesus stop all that so that Mary and Martha didn't have to grieve and go through that pain? And we ask the same question sometimes. Jesus, why do I have to go through what I'm going through? God, why are you allowing this to happen to me? God, what's your plan in all this? And I believe Mary and Martha probably asked that question. Jesus, why weren't you here? Why didn't you come? I thought you loved Lazarus. Verse 38, then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone laid against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Here's another case where Jesus is asking for them to trust him. Jesus says, roll away the stone. It takes more effort. Now, I'm not preaching that we can earn our salvation today. I'm not preaching that we can earn our way to heaven. But what I am suggesting this morning is we can't just sit and wait. There may be things that Jesus is asking you and I to do that we need to do in order for him to be able to really show what he wants to do in our lives. And it may not make sense sometimes. It didn't make sense for them to roll that stone away and allow that foul odor to come out. And so it might not make sense for you and I to expose what we're hiding because there's going to be a stench. But Jesus is saying, trust me. Just do what I'm asking you to do. And then get out of the way and let me show you the rest of my plan. Verse 40, Jesus says to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Wow. That was just 20 verses ago when Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life, Martha. Do you believe this?" And she says, "Yeah." And now she already forgot. man, we forget so quick, don't we? We get caught up in these things that are coming into our life, and they cloud our view, and they take our focus off of God, and all of a sudden we feel like we're all alone. And Jesus just kindly reminds Martha, did I not tell you? Just believe. Verse 40, so they took the stone away. The effort. They rolled the stone away, and they revealed what was inside the tomb. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I say this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And so Jesus says, Father, I'm saying all this for the account of the people. To me, that tells me that Jesus had the best interest of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in mind. He had the best interest of all the Jews. He says, for all those here. He had their best interest in mind. And brothers and sisters, Jesus has our best interest in mind. He has our best interest in mind. He cares about each one of us. All he wants is for us to believe. Believe. Verse 43, so when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice. And I still picture Jesus still grieving, still crying. And so I could picture in his brokenness, in between sobs, he cries out, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linens and strips, and his face wrapped with the cloth. And so I don't know how Lazarus came out. I don't know how he was wrapped. I don't know if his legs were wrapped individually, that he was able to walk, or if it was tight and he came shuffling out, or what. But he's bound. He's wrapped. His face is still wrapped. His hands are wrapped. He's still helpless. He's alive. He's breathing. But he's helpless. But Jesus says to them, unbind him and let him go. I don't know when Lazarus' odor disappeared. I don't know if that stench came out with him. I don't know if it took a couple weeks for that stench to disappear. But what I know is Lazarus was free. He was no longer dead. There was life, there was breath. He was unbound. When Jesus spoke the words, he was unbound. And what's interesting to me is it took others to help unbind him. And sometimes I need people to speak into my life. You need people to speak into your life to help unbind you. And that's okay. That's okay. Jesus worked through others to set Lazarus free. Now, you would think that when you see this, you would be in awe about who Jesus was. And there some were. In verse 45, we see many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. That's the 8th time we see the word believed. They saw the physical miracle, and so they believed. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Now remember, they're only 2 miles away from Jerusalem, where Jesus made this ruckus in the temple and was accused of blasphemy. And so some of the people who saw that ran 2 miles to Jerusalem to tell the Pharisees what's going on with Jesus. They were the doubters. They were the ones who were loyal to past things. They were the ones who were comfortable with the way things were and didn't want to see change. They were the ones who were stuck in tradition. And here's this new guy that's just trying to change things. Verse 47, so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many miracles. And so these religious leaders are really confused. And so they gather together and they ask each other, what do we do? What do we do about this guy? Yeah, he's performing these miracles and he's doing many signs. They were confused. And I wrote here that unless Jesus is on your team, unless you're on Jesus' team, there'll be confusion in your life. And I believe even sometimes when Jesus is on my team and I'm on his team, I'm still confused. The disciples, we see the disciples confused many times. And they would ask Jesus, what did you mean by that? Jesus, what did that story mean? Jesus, how did you feed those 5,000 people? And so just because Jesus is on my team doesn't mean at times in my life I won't be confused. But if I stick with him and I don't throw him off my team, eventually there'll be light. And so these Pharisees are confused. In verse 48, they say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. That's what they're scared of. If we let Jesus go on, everybody's going to believe. And they didn't want that. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Sheldon preached, what must I do to be saved? Believe. And I believe that's what Jesus is trying to hammer through in this whole story and what's happening here. Just believe. They went on to say in verse 48, not only will everybody believe in him, but the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And so they weren't just afraid of Jesus having everybody believe in him, they were afraid of losing their power. Jesus is going to take away, the Romans will come in and take away our place of authority. They're going to take away our nation. We won't have our freedom. And so what the Pharisees thought was freedom was actually captivity. Verse 49. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. And I wrote there, a slam. He basically slapped them. You don't know anything at all. And then he doesn't stop there. Now he throws a punch. He goes, nor do you understand. And so here's this Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, who stepped up and set everybody straight because he had all the answers. And what's interesting is what he says next, we're told he didn't say of himself, but it was something that God told him to say. What did he say? You don't understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people. Is it better that one man should die for the people, or that the whole nation should perish? He did not say this on his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. And so here he thought he was being smart and telling his followers, the Pharisees and Sadducees, what was really going to happen. It's better to let one man die than the whole nation die. But really what he was saying was, let's let this one person die so the nation doesn't have to be lost. And so that everyone can be gathered together, referring to the resurrection. And then verse 53, so from that day on, they made plans, they plotted, they schemed to put Jesus to death. Let's read the rest of the chapter. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim. And so, once Jesus found out about their plot, we see Jesus heading northeast another 15 miles or so. And Ephraim was a wild, uncultivated hill country. And that's where Jesus hung out for the next week. And if I have the timeline right, within about a week, we see Jesus coming back again, coming into Jerusalem, riding on a colt. And we know that that was the beginning of the end for Jesus. But in that week there, Jesus went northeast to Ephraim just to finish out his ministry. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all? Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. And so we see Jesus do this amazing miracle, And then we see him pulling away because they didn't believe. In fact, they sought to kill him. I have to wonder, how many times have I done that to Jesus? How many times have you done that to Jesus? There's things that he did in your life, or in my life, or there's things that he's asking you and I to do that we just don't have the courage to do. Is that any different than the Pharisees who just witnessed this miracle and turned around and plotted to kill him? We sing the song sometimes, or we hear the song of, my sins were the ones that put Jesus on the cross. I might as well had the hammer in my hand and drove the nails into him. And I'm guilty of that. And I think if we're all honest, we'd all say at times we are. But Jesus wants to comfort you. Jesus wants to meet you wherever you are, whatever state you're in, whatever valley you're going through, whatever is heavy on your mind, he wants to care for that. And as I came across and as I felt led to this passage this morning, it was refreshing to me again just to see Jesus' love, just to see his compassion, and the thought of Jesus being deeply troubled and grieved for a human being. Why wouldn't he for you? Why wouldn't he for me? So I just want to encourage you this morning. Allow Jesus to care for you wherever you're at, whatever you're going through. Allow him to be your peace and your comfort. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you so much for your love. I thank you for being a God of miracles. And as Nelson preached the other Sunday, the finite versus the infinite mindset. We don't understand what all you're doing. But just help us to believe. We don't have to have it all figured out. We don't have to know the beginning and the end before we move forward. But you just show us what the next step is. Help us to take that step. I just pray for each one here. I pray that you would just meet them, that you would just show them the meeting place that you want to meet them at, and you would give them the courage to meet you there. And maybe it's you're knocking on the door and all they have to do is open the door. But it still takes effort on their end. I just pray that you would just meet each soul where it's at today. Pray a blessing on the remainder of this day. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.